So now how do we segue from Theseus into Jason? If you think about Theseus, he's the 10th king of Athens. And from that point on, there are a lot of changes to Athenian history. As everywhere else in the ancient world, including Rome, the people, those not in power, insist upon more and more say in the way things are going. And the very first thing they insist upon is a law code. Okay, and the first law code was written up by a guy named Draco, who's Draco, whose name in ancient Greek means the dragon. So I don't need to tell you what kind of law code it was. I mean, can you imagine someone saying, hey, here's this really beautiful, great law code by the dragon. Okay, it's just, here we go with more symbolism. You may think I'm overusing the word symbolism, but I'm not. It's all over the place. Okay, so that wasn't good enough. The dragon law code, the law code of Draco, was, think in terms of the Hammurabi law code in Mesopotamia. It was ridiculously harsh. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth type stuff. You steal a loaf of bread if you're starving and you get your arm chopped off, or at least your hand, stuff like that. So it was considered to be a first attempt at giving the people what they wanted. A law code, so why? A statute. Okay, that word comes from the Latin meaning to stand. Something that is permanent, something that stands, as opposed to whoever's in power dictating what is the case from an eminence and saying, you have to obey, and who says? I do. That authoritarian kind of stuff. Now you have a law code. A good start, but not good enough. Okay, so as time goes on, the law code ends up being a sham, and now what you need, even more than a law code, is you need the people to have a sense of being treated with some degree of fairness by those in power. And the only way for that to happen is for those in power not to abuse the power that they have. And the way that happened organically, as we talked about on the day we spent on the second day of the semester, I think it was, on the overview of Greek history, don't forget, was slowly but surely more and more people were able to afford what was required to defend themselves about those in power. In other words, there's no other way to put it, and it's not a Second Amendment soapbox thing, because I don't get political or religious in my classes, but this is historically true. It was a matter of those within the palace being the only ones who were able to afford the weapons that they needed to defend themselves, and as time went on, and new ways of achieving wealth and new means of trading one thing for another arose, then more and more people got weapons, and once more and more people got weapons, the people behind the walls of the palace no longer had the advantage of being the only ones who could defend themselves. And once you had that situation going, that was the beginning of a new kind of fighting that required all of the people to participate, rather than just one-on-one fighting between kings and princes and retainers of the king within the palace. So when you're looking at Homer, which we're going to get to after we get to Jason, when you get to Homer, you're still in the early stages, because don't forget there's a 500-year distance between Homer and the Trojan War. You're still in that prehistoric period where the only ones fighting the war are those who could afford the weapons to fight the war. And they were the ones who came along with the kings from all the different places in Greece and sailed to Troy in order to defend whatever, if it's true historically, the honor based on Helen being stolen, etc., stuff that we're going to be talking about. But the idea here is that once the people started to feel in the historical period of Greece, after Homer, that they were needed in order to fight the wars, and that was really the touchstone, okay, because otherwise everything's hunky-dory at home. Okay, so in order to fight the wars, they were needed. Once that was understood, not only by the people but also by those in power, then the people had a lot more say and a lot more leverage over those behind the walls, to the point to where the walls didn't matter anymore. And then it got slowly but surely more and more into, it grew from a monarchy to a democracy via tyranny. Via the people saying, hey, wait a minute, because all they knew was rule by one, the king. Okay, so you have the king behind the walls of the palace. The kind of, the order of rule was, it all began with monarchy, in the prehistoric period, and then the stuff that I'm talking about now developed into the people getting more and more of a sense of being indispensable to the running of the state, etc., and them determining that the only way the most just way to be governed was, because the only model they had was the king, was to have, in effect, a king out of their own number, as opposed to out of the number of those who had been born into the right families, etc., the aristocrats, the people who were behind the walls. Okay? So now you have people outside of the walls saying, hey, wait a minute, screw them. Now we're set. We have weapons. Okay? We have weapons. They no longer have the advantage over us because they can defend themselves. So what advantage do they have over us? The only advantage they have over us is a nominal advantage, because they still are called the leaders of the polis. The king is still called the king. Screw that. Okay, and that's where the idea of tyranny comes from. The first tyrants were from the number of the regular people, the people outside of the walls, outside of the palace walls. And they chose one of their number to represent them, and to become, in effect, the new king, and to overtake the king that was behind the walls, to the extent to where it was so successful that the walls pretty much became a museum. Okay, the way it is in, say, if you go to Beijing, if you go travel and look at the old palace, the summer palace in Beijing, pretty fascinating stuff. It's just a bunch of ruins now because of a lot of the developments that occurred there. So that happens around the world and in different periods, this idea of the power shifting from those who are in power because they say that they are, and everybody has to listen to them because they're the only ones who can stand behind the power that they are supposedly given by the gods. And then by extension, how can the people disagree with that? And also, since they're the only ones who can defend themselves, then of course they're going to continue to perpetuate that illusion to the point where now the power is in the hand of the chosen people from the masses. And that goes okay at first in Athens. So now we're back to Athens. In Athens, that went okay. The very first tyrant, he was Pisistratus, was his name. This is from, I think I brought it up on the second day of class, but Pisistratus was the name of the first tyrant of Athens. Okay, this is after Theseus. This is after all the Theseus stuff and everything. Okay. Okay, so now we're on to the tyrants. And the first tyrant was a good one. And it was at a time before the word tyrant even had negative connotations. So the first tyrant of Athens, Pisistratus, was really good for the people. And things were running just fine. But then, unfortunately, what happened is Pisistratus died somehow. No one knows for sure. And his sons sucked. And then, because of his sons, then all of a sudden, the idea of tyranny got a very negative connotation. Leading to what? Another tyrant taking over. It was better in the eyes of the people than another king taking over and getting back to that old story. So now you have another tyrant. And this time you got a decent one. And his name was Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes. Cleitthenes. Cleisthenes. You know me. I don't get you guys about spelling. Just come close to Cleisthenes. Pisistratus. P-E-I-S stratus. Peace, P-E-I-S-I stratus. That's his name. That's the first guy. Then the second tyrant, the second really big one, is Cleisthenes, and he is nicknamed the father of democracy. So that's good enough for us to, reiterate some of the historical stuff we looked at the beginning of the semester, just to get us up to speed here, and to remind us, the events leading up to democracy and all that. And so once you had that, then what happens, supposedly, according to most of the history books, is slowly but surely in Athens, with the rule of Pisistratus, and then the unfortunate interlude of his sons, but then, thank gosh, Cleisthenes coming up with all kinds of reforms that led to democracy, although it didn't include women. So you want to put quotes around democracy. Or slaves, by the way. I should say, or slaves, of course. Okay. Then what you have is a slow period where Athens starts justifiably getting its reputation for being the cultural center of Greece. Slowly but surely. And now we're talking about in the 6th century BC. Okay, so don't forget, the Archaic period begins with Homer around 750 BC, and then you get into all that period that we were talking about today with the changes, all this phase of the people getting more and more power, and Pisistratus and Cleisthenes ruling. And now you get to the point where Athens is so well established as a democracy, and I'll stop putting quotes around it because I already qualified it, is becoming such an effective democracy that not only around Greece is there a kind of envy that builds up. This is in most of the history books. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But this is the story. That there's so much of an envy about how great Athens is becoming and about how much of a cultural center they are, or epicenter for the rest of Greece, that not only the Greeks who aren't Athenians start getting envious, but also people outside of Greece, potential enemies of Greece, who are in terms of power, and here we're talking more about military and political power, are the counterparts of the Athenians in their parts of the world. And the most famous, for good reason, of these is the Persian Empire. Okay? It's a little tricky to say the Persians. We're not talking about people, because there's a bunch of different peoples that comprise the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire is slowly but surely what built up in its part of the world, which is to the east of Greece, separated by part of the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, in the middle of which is the island of Delos, very symbolically where Apollo and Artemis were born, and which will eventually take on a lot more symbolic impact after the Persian Wars. And so now you have this situation where the Persian Empire is hearing more and more about this little place with at most 100,000 citizens called Athens. And they have millions and millions of people, and they get to the point where they can take it no longer. This is the history books say, and they needed to show the Athenians who was boss. Okay. Now the movie 300 kind of gives you some idea of what we're talking about with stuff like that. Okay. In the movie 300, you have this idea of an ambassador from the Persian Empire going to Greece, to Athens in particular, and requiring water, earth and water. Earth and water. In other words, what does that mean? It means requiring Athens to hand over something, and it just happens to be earth and water, to the Persian Empire to signify to them that whatever the Persian Empire insists the Greeks give to them, they give to them, and the price, the reward for that is not getting destroyed by the Persian Empire. But the Greeks say, F you. Okay. Now, there's one other aspect to this, and that is that there were islands off the coast of what would eventually be the western coast of the Persian Empire. So think about east and west. And so the western coast of the Persian Empire, islands right off here that are Greek. Okay, and so these Greek islands are so close to the Persian Empire that the Persian Empire gets to the point where they attack these islands and insist upon them paying tribute to the Persian Empire, and with the reward being that they won't be destroyed by the Persian Empire. And at first they play ball for a couple decades, but then there becomes this event leading on into the 5th century, so the very tail end of the 6th century BC, where there's a revolt called the Ionian Revolt, because these islands I just mentioned are called the Ionian Islands. So they revolt against the Persian Empire and say, no, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to pay you tribute. Screw you. And then not only that, they appeal to the rest of Greece to help them out. And it just so happens that Athens is the one that takes it upon themselves to do the most to help out these Ionian Islands. And so the Persian Empire not only hears about how amazing culturally Athens is, but they also hear about these upstarts daring to challenge the political and military ascendancy of the Persian Empire by messing with their shit. You know what I mean? Those are their islands. How dare you? Even though you are nominally Greek, You do what we say or you're screwed. And that was the idea. And so for those two reasons mainly, and it may or may not be true, this is what all the history books say, the two big reasons why the Persian Empire got pissed off enough toward the Greeks, but especially the Athenians. That was the beginning. Those were the events leading up to the very first of three main battles of the Persian Wars in 490 BC, the beginning of the 5th century BC. Okay, and that battle is called Marathon. The Greeks won, and there was a runner of the Greeks who ran 26 miles to deliver the news that the Greeks won the Battle of Marathon, and hence the 26 miles roughly 26 miles of a marathon. Okay, so Battle of Marathon, the Greeks won, but that was mainly because the Persian Empire underestimated the firepower of the Greeks, and in particular the Athenians, and they were very significantly unaware of that advantage, the military advantage the Athenians had, because of this new way of fighting that I mentioned earlier. This idea of it's not one-on-one combat anymore like in Homer. Now it's a long wall of troops fighting with a shield in front of them that covers one shoulder, and then the person right next to one person covers the other shoulder that's exposed, and so on down the line, and that's called hoplite warfare. And because of hoplite, and by the way, a lot of this is review from that second day, so look at your notes. We talked about this stuff on that day as well. And so because of the Persian Empire underestimating how many troops in Greece were willing to fight in the Battle of Marathon, and also the advanced technology of how the Greeks fought, the Greeks were able to win the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. But then in 480 BC, 10 years later, the Persian Empire thought that they had learned all the lessons they needed to from Marathon. And in 480 BC, 10 years later, the Battle of Thermopylae, immortalized by the 300 from Sparta. There were others too who helped, but not that many, who were willing to stand at the very end and fight. And 300, even though there's a lot of, it's like overwhelmingly fictional in so much aspects of it, still does a decent job at getting across what Herodotus, the main historian we rely on for chronicling the Persian Wars, gets across. The sense of the heroism of the Spartans for standing up against the Persian Empire in the Battle of Thermopylae, despite the loss. So Marathon was a Greek victory. Thermopylae was a Greek defeat, but supposedly gave the Greeks a bigger boost of morale even than Marathon did. So that in the third and final decisive battle called Salamis, Salamis, that was won by the Greeks, and that was, although they didn't know it at the time, and that's going to be a very important point this is all leading to Jason. So at the Battle of Salamis in 479 BC, a year after Thermopylae, the reason why the Greeks, and in particular the Athenians, were able to win that battle is because there was a general, whose name I won't give you because I've been giving you a million names anyway, who came up with the idea that the only way they were going to really be able to decisively beat the Persian Empire was not by land but by sea. And so most of the resources were military resources were devoted to building up the most impressive fleet in the world, according to the Greeks at least, at that time. And that led to a primarily naval victory of the Athenians over the Persian Empire in the Battle of Salamis in 479 BC. Okay. Good place to pause. Take a breath. Okay. Are you taking a breath? Okay. Good place to take a breath here and realize what's going on. The Greeks have just, according to the Greeks at least, the Persians don't agree, but according to the Greeks, this may very well be the end of the Persian Wars. The Greeks may very well have won the war, and everyone agrees that it was the Athenians who by far played the most important role in the Greek victory over the Persian Empire. Okay? Now, in the back of your mind, you should know that that was the propaganda, that it's all over. But there was no way whatsoever for the Greeks to know that it truly was the end of the war, given the fact that that Battle of Salamis was 11 years into fighting this war. By the way, the Trojan War was 10 years, kind of symbolic, kind of close. But anyway, so there was no way for the Greeks to know whether or not they really defeated the Persian Empire. So there was a general whose name is important enough for me to write on the board if I can find chalk and not scratch the board like I did the other day and freak everybody out. A name you must know, Pericles. Pericles. For reasons that are too boring to get into, Pericles becomes the foremost, the most powerful man in Athens after the Persian Wars. Okay? Now there are others before him, but they're overtaken in ways that it's spent too long about in history books. It's not that exciting. Bottom line is Pericles becomes the guy who gets the most power in Athens. Don't forget, Athens is a full-fledged, as far as citizenry goes, which is just men. But if you're cool with that, then yeah, it's a democracy. It's a legitimate democracy because all of the citizens are ruling things, or at least everybody who wants to. Any citizen who wants to take part in the running of government. Not a representative democracy like what we have, where we elect people to run things, but they themselves did the running of things. Okay, and so Pericles was a guy who was considered by those people who ran things to be the most important guy and the guy who could call most of the shots for the very simple reason, and predictable even, that he had the greatest number of troops behind him. Now this is going to really ring a bell when we get a little bit into Rome later on, but just remember that. Okay, so Pericles has most of the authority, the military/political authority. And so he starts becoming the figurehead of Athens after the Persian Wars. And what that entails is him conveying to the rest of Greece that if they want protection from any future enemies, not just the Persian Empire, but any other enemies that there might have been, and there were others, the Scythians, the Parthians, all kinds of other peoples around the world who could have been potential enemies to Greece. They needed to band together in a group that Pericles was going to start called the Delian League, named after the island of Delos, where Apollo and Artemis are from, is now going to become, in the historical period, not just the mythical period, another epicenter of historical development. And that is as the place where the treasury of the Delian League is going to be located. And here's the idea. Everybody from all over Greece has to come and pay tribute to it. Now, this is ringing a bell because we got into Dionysus, we got into theater and all that stuff. So congratulate yourselves for knowing all that other stuff already that we don't have to go back into, right? This is how it's all connected to that idea of theater and Dionysus and everybody coming every year, blah, blah, blah. You see how it all connects? Okay? So a lot of this was reiterated from what we talked about, but hopefully it put it in a historical perspective that led up to it a little more logically for you to really understand how it's all connected. So all you need to know now is that as time went on, for this class at least, as time went on, you had more and more, just like the Persian Empire supposedly, this is all supposed, got resentful toward Greece for becoming too big, too much of a threat, and so they needed to be stopped. And we're going to stop them, and then hence the beginning of the Persian Wars. So supposedly, according to history books, because they have to have a story, so nobody knows if it's true or not. This is the narrative that you find in just about every history book about ancient Greece. So because of Pericles insisting upon everybody coming to Athens every year and paying tribute to Athens via the Delian League, whose treasury now is no longer on the neutral island of Delos, but in Athens itself, for reasons we talked about before, and to come and to partake in the Panathenaic festival with all the dramatic contests, this and that. Slowly but surely, I say that a lot, but it's true, there was a development here. There was a resentment now, not by the Persian Empire, but by the competitor of Athens, par excellence, easily the most formidable competitor of Athens for various reasons, including still having resentment about the Battle of Thermopylae and being pretty much left alone to fight, the 300 at the pass in Thermopylae. Sparta, obviously. Okay, so Sparta started to, according to the history books, to resent the Athenians, no differently than the Persian Empire before the Persian Wars had resented the Greeks altogether. So you have the Greeks altogether resented by the Persian Empire. The Persian Wars, a Greek victory, the Persian Wars attributed, for good reason, primarily to the Athenians, and then the Athenians getting a big head about it, especially Pericles, okay, and him pretty much dictating to the rest of Greece that they need to come to Athens every year and pay tribute to the Delian League. Now here's the big problem. Pericles didn't stop there. Pericles didn't stop with saying, hey, we're so much better than all you guys because we're the ones who pretty much won the Persian Wars. He didn't stop saying, hey, come to Athens and look at how great these plays are that we're going to perform for you, and how we have a cultural offering that no one else in the world has. But he did the thing that was pretty much the third strike, according to especially the Spartans, and that was spend the money of the Delian League treasury in ways that was considered to be wasteful and that aggrandized, that made better Athens at the expense of everybody else who was paying the money. Why? To be protected militarily. Athens figures, wait a minute, it's a little bit overkill. Where are the Persians? Where's the Persian Empire? Where are the enemies? It looks like it's all over. Everything's cool. So, and this is among themselves, by the way. So, hey, we got to do something. We have to build up Athens into a worthy capital of the Delian League, which requires building all kinds of temples and all kinds of shrines and all kinds of architectural complexes, and the theater of Dionysus, things like that. And so as that went on and on, Sparta in particular got resentful enough to where slowly but surely, what other way can you say it, that there was this slow process of members of the Delian League defecting and going on the side of Sparta, and other members staying firmly loyal to Athens. Okay, now, there are only two names I need to give you for all this stuff in terms of the chronicling of it all. All of the Persian War stuff was chronicled most famously and almost exclusively by a guy who was named the father of history, and his name was Herodotus. Herodotus. Okay, so he's the, quote, father of history. I won't tell you why there's quotes around it, but the next guy claimed that he wasn't as much a historian as a mythographer. He's the Persian Wars guy. And now this guy Thucydides, comfortably into the 5th century, even getting close into the 4th century, he's the guy who chronicled the Peloponnesian War. Because the Peloponnesus is the southern part of Greece. That's where Sparta is. Okay, so Thucydides is the chronicler of the Peloponnesian War. What is the Peloponnesian War? For the sake of this class, the Peloponnesian War is the war. The Peloponnesian War is to the American Civil War as the Persian Wars are to the American Revolutionary War. It's a good syllogism. A is to B as C is to D. Got me? Our history in the U.S. started with the Revolutionary War against Britain, right? Okay. Then later on, as time went on, you have the Civil War within the United States. Greece had the same thing. And by the way, so did Rome. Okay. So there is a civil war eventually, and the beginning of the classical period of Greece, because we looked at the 3 different historical periods of Greece, starting with the Archaic, then the Classical. The beginning of the Classical period, 490 BC, is the beginning of the Persian Wars, and the end of the Classical is the end of the Peloponnesian War. So you have these bookends of the international war after the Trojan War. That's the first international one. But the Persian Wars begin the Classical period, and then the Peloponnesian War ends the Classical period. And so what happens then? What happens with the ending of the Peloponnesian War? Sparta kicks the shit out of Athens. Okay? It's just the bottom line. Right? Duh. Right? Because guess what? Athens has this giant fleet, but wait a minute. Oh, last time I checked, the Peloponnese is land. And so Sparta destroyed Athens, almost destroyed all of Athens, allowed them to continue running because they didn't want to destroy them completely, but defeated Athens handily because they were. It was very predictable, really, in the big picture. They were the most formidable fighters by land in Greece. And so they won. And here's the big problem. What happened was that now there was this giant power vacuum because Athens had not only been the center of Greece militarily and politically with respect to the Persian Empire, but they were also the cultural hub of Greece. They held Greece together culturally. People from all over Greece came because of the Delian League every year, and there was this sense of Greece being the center of something, kind of like New York, L.A., Chicago, whatever, that's a cliche at least, or more easily said in France, Paris. Okay, everybody, obviously that's the thing, cultural hub, right? That's the idea behind the Athens. That's what Athens was to Greece. Now that Athens is defeated by Sparta, now what? Sparta was nothing close to Athens when it came to a sense of being a legitimate cultural center of Greece, and so now there was a cultural vacuum and a breaking up of what in the past hadn't been recognized as being so important, but now that was seen as important, and that is this idea, this illusion, that everybody all over Greece is one thing. Now there's no more center to that idea. The center fell out. There was no more anchor. And now Sparta was not a worthy, they even admitted it, was not a worthy cultural center of Greece. And so there's a vacuum not only militarily and politically, but also culturally. And that vacuum was filled by certain people, and here's the connection with Jason, get ready, from way, way up in Greece. If I showed you a map, all I would be doing is showing you a bunch of land way at the top of Greece, very high up in Greece, called Macedonia. And that's where a guy named Philip II ruled as a king. Because we're not talking Greece anymore. Macedonia was not part of Greece. It was a part outside of Greece, of the part of the world outside of Greece. But, had a lot of similarities to Greece culturally. So Philip II is a general and a king of Macedonia who recognized this power center that I just told you about, after the Peloponnesian War. And we're at the end of the 5th century BC, moving on into the 4th century BC, which means the 300s. Okay, and so now Philip comes down, and he was going to take advantage of this power vacuum, and he does. But before he's able to do very much, he dies. And he's taken over by his extremely young son, Alexander. And that's the Alexander the Great thing. All right, so eventually this guy will be called Alexander the Great because of all the territory that he conquered. And we're talking about a guy in his late teens. Okay, a guy who was raised from childhood to eventually take over daddy as king of Macedonia. So he's in his teens. And that's going to kind of have an echo in Rome, by the way, when you get to the first emperor, Augustus. He's in his teens as well. Okay, so once that happens, once you have Alexander taking over, he was more or less, what's the word? Merciful. It's a good word. Merciful conqueror to the Greeks. Not to the rest of the world, but to the Greeks down south. Athens especially. And so, it was an easy defeat, by the Macedonians over the Greeks. But here's the catch. Alexander, Philip's already out of the picture. Alexander tells Athens, tells Sparta, tells the rest of Greece, you guys are a mess. You guys should be embarrassed by what you turned Greece into because of this ridiculous civil war fighting crap. But what we're going to do is we're going to cut our losses, and we're not going to destroy you guys. We're going to tell you that you need to either be destroyed or come along with us. Come along where? Come along with us and finish the job that you guys didn't really finish in the Persian Wars. We're going to really win the Persian Wars. But instead of waiting for the Persian Empire to come to us, we're going to them. That's what Alexander said. And he did that. He gathered up the numbers, no one knows for sure, but just the unprecedentedly large number of Greek troops. And they went by land all the way into the Persian Empire. And eventually went from one place to another, starting in the Persian Empire and then eventually to India and various other places around the world, and created an empire that the world had never seen before, and until the Roman Empire, by far the largest empire of the world, including the Persian Empire. Okay, pretty much the known world at the time was incorporated into it in one way or another, or at least subject to it enough to where they had to do the bidding of the Macedonians. Okay, so now Alexander is firmly in the driver's seat all over the world, but here he is in the Persian Empire, and now what? You know, the question is now what? Okay, so, and also in India, etc., but most famously in the Persian Empire. And there he is, and he takes over the Persian Empire. So now, in effect, he's the king not only of Macedonia and not only of Greece, because now we're back to monarchy officially, but also of Persia itself. And he becomes, in effect, the Persian king himself. And his men, at first, are like, oh, of course you're going to do this, you know, because you beat the Persian Empire. But one thing that disturbs Alexander's men is that he starts dressing like a Persian king. And he starts getting way into Persian customs. And he starts getting way into Persian culture. He starts getting, you know what I mean? So he, on the one hand, recognizes Athens, enough not to destroy it, as the former most important cultural hub, or cultural capital of the world, from his perspective. But he's kind of digging this new place, these new places in the east that he's conquered. So what are you going to do about that? What he does is he decides that this is, before he dies, he needs to some way or another set up a new Athens. He's not going to destroy Athens. He's going to, in effect, and not just in effect, but literally in some ways, when it comes to books and stuff like that, transport Athenian culture to the east, where he already happens to be and where he really, loves it. Okay? And he does this in a particular area, of one of the places that he conquered, and this is northern Africa. Egypt is the center of Alexander the Great's new world cultural capital. And he calls this place that is considered to be the new Athens, Alexandria, named after himself. And you got to admit, if someone gets to name it after themselves, come on. In this case, who else are you going to name it after, right? And Alexandria becomes the new Athens. And it really does. It's not just lip service. And the way that it does is connected to, the reason I did all this stuff and took almost the whole class period today leading up to it, is that all the stuff that I just did is going to help you appreciate what is different about Jason as a mythical hero. He is best known from, and almost exclusively known, from a source that comes a couple hundred years almost, 150-something years, after the end of the Trojan Wars. Before Alexander dies, he breaks up his kingdom into various sections, okay, the most famous being, and the most important culturally, being the Egyptian section. Okay, there was also the Macedonian. There was also various other parts of the Alexandrian Empire that had been broken up. But Egypt was most famous because of its capital was a city that Alexander founded before he died, named after him, called Alexandria. So Alexandria, Virginia, on the north coast of Egypt. All right, and so Alexandria was famous for being the place that even Alexander, before he died, claimed was going to become literally called this, to give you some idea how important Athens was culturally, the new Athens. Right? So Alexander proclaimed that Alexandria, the city that he founded, was going to be the new Athens. Because it was understood that even though Athens was still going, even though you had guys like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle living in Athens and doing their thing and keeping philosophy alive, and various artists and various orators and things like that, Athens was still going and kind of still an important cultural center. It was nothing like it had been in its heyday. And so you have this new place, Alexandria. And in Alexandria, you have what's called the Museum of Alexandria. And then within the Museum of Alexandria, and by the way, the museum just means place of the muses, the goddesses who inspire poets, historians, various other what were considered to be artists. So historians were included as artists in that respect, right? So you have the museum, which is the place of the muses, and then as time went on, it takes on the associations of a place where things from the past are, displayed for you to look at, etc. But it was much more than that when the museum was founded. And then within the Museum of Alexandria, you have an even more famous place throughout the ages called the Library of Alexandria. And at the library, certain things went on that were extremely important for us, because we wouldn't be having a class like this probably without it. And that is that the first task, that was entrusted to the Alexandrian librarians, was to preserve the great works from the past in Greece, the ancient past from the standpoint of these people. So we're talking about 250 years or so, 10 generations earlier in Greece. The greatest works that there had been performed on the stage in the case of drama, or performed in palaces in the case of epic and lyric poetry, etc. Right? And so that was the first nominal task that was given to the Alexandrian librarians. But there were two other tasks that the librarians were entrusted to the librarians. One was to decide which of the works are most important to not only preserve, but to edit, to work on, to compare various, in some cases, many different manuscripts of, and to come up as close as possible to the manuscript that was the one that was closest to what the original manuscript was, and from which all of the other manuscripts were just versions of it. Okay, and so how do you do that? Well, you have to come up with a new way of comparing and contrasting different manuscripts, and almost a science called philology, okay, which literally means the love of words. Okay, the love of words. It's a rare case, if not the only case, where the logi is the thing that's studied as opposed to the study of suffix. So geology is the study of the earth. Psychology is the study of the psyche. In this case, the phil means love, right? And then the logi comes from logos in ancient Greek, meaning word. So love of words, right? So this kind of, somewhat more an art than a science, but they did the best they could to come up with, come up with some kind of system for doing this. They would compare and contrast different manuscripts and argue, for one reading after another. And then the reason mainly for this is kind of, necessity is the mother of invention kind of thing. You had limited space in the library. You had only so many manuscripts that you could keep in the library and preserve. And that had a lot to do with why certain authors were chosen over others through time. For our purposes, the important thing to know is the third, and for our purposes much more significant than the first two, task that the librarians at Alexandria had, and that was to create art in their own right. So there were two librarians, most famous, at the Library of Alexandria: Apollonius Rhodius, and then Callimachus. These are important guys, real important guys. Not only because they were some of the best textual amenders, practitioners of philology, but also because they were artists in their own right. And they represented a new way of doing art. There were artists who did sculptures and paintings, etc., who also did, okay? And their work reflected the innovations that these guys were responsible for. So we'll stick with them because this has to do with Jason. Apollonius is the guy who created the epic called the Argonautica, the epic of the Argonauts. The Argo is the name of the ship that Jason and those who joined him on his expedition went on. Okay, and it had magical powers, etc. And it was kind of a, Siri in a way, in the sense that you tell it what to do and it does it, and etc. So it was kind of visionary. So the Argonautica is Apollonius Rhodius's epic, and then Callimachus was the lyric poet. Callimachus was the guy who wrote lyric poetry and also what he called little epics, because the idea was there was actually a battle between Callimachus and Apollonius, a public battle between them because one followed the other, so they were contemporaries. So what does Callimachus have a beef about? What's his story? He says, Apollonius, you're misguided in your attempt to resurrect the epic and to do new things with it, and yet at the same time to acknowledge that Homer is the shizzle, okay? Because everybody knows he is. Let's just leave that alone. The epic is dead, all right? It's all about Homer. It's all over. No, Apollonius disagrees. Callimachus says, no. The epic is dead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new kind of lyric poetry, a new kind of personal poetry, right? A simple, small form poetry, okay? So how did he distinguish himself from the lyric poets of the past? As a librarian of Alexandria and an unabashed intellectual, created a new kind of poetry that is distinguished by its ridiculous difficulty, by its almost oracular nature, its lack of clarity in terms of what it says. When you read Homer, every single line of 15,000 whatever and 12,000 whatever lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey, respectively, you pretty much understand. Everybody in here, we would agree what Homer's saying. And then we can talk about what it means in terms of emotions and this and that. But it's pretty straightforward that when Homer says something, you know what he says. You understand it. It's straightforward. You get it. One person is doing something, and others do not. God comes down, does something. When it comes to Callimachus, there's a lot of room for interpretation. He makes you work. And so it's unabashedly elitist poetry. It's only geared toward those who have the education and the subtle appreciation for the nuances of the Greek language to be able to go deeply into this poetry and to interpret it, okay? And so that's how Callimachus distinguishes himself from Apollonius. And the idea was, Apollonius was trying, he knew he could never improve on Homer because everybody knew that. Homer was it. Homer was like inspired so much that nobody ever come close in quality in epic to Homer. But Apollonius at least said it's worth a try to keep alive the epic genre, and then to do new things with it. So he was an innovator within the context of bringing epic back to Greek literature. Because we're still talking about Greek culture, even though we're in Egypt, okay, the new Athens and stuff. So think about that. So the generals who took over these different kind of mini empires after the empire had been broken up after Alexander died, they were Greeks. Okay, they were Greeks. And then as time went on, they incorporated people from the indigenous peoples from places that we're talking about, but they were Greeks. So really this was an attempt to transplant Greek culture all over the world. All right, is the idea. All right. So Apollonius says, I'm going to make an epic about a new hero, a new kind of hero, and Jason is that hero. So what is new? What is different about Jason? Okay, the first thing that comes to mind is that he is unrecognizable. I should put it this way: unrecognizably unidealistic. He's not an idealistic type hero. He's a hero that is one step away from an everyday person who just happens to, kind of a Batman in that sense. Okay, so he doesn't have the superpowers. He's not necessarily even divine. Nobody makes a big deal out of his lineage because some sources say he has some divinity in him, others not, but it's not a giant issue for him the way it is for for Heracles, for Perseus, and for Theseus. Okay? So think of it that way. He's one step away from being an ordinary person rather than a hero when it comes to blood, to lineage. Okay? So he has to be great by virtue almost exclusively, depending on whether you're looking at the thing that says he has divinity or not, he has to depend on his own achievements, for his heroism. Okay? And so what he does, like any smart, kind of maybe not divine hero will do, is he gets help. So he, on his expedition, chooses various heroes from around Greece to join him, including Heracles and including Theseus, kind of the mini Heracles, right? The indigenous hero of Athens. So this is the archetype, and this is something new, and this has to do with why Apollonius is innovative. Not only because Jason is a new kind of hero, kind of a more human hero, more vulnerable to falling in love, things like that, but also this idea of taking others with you on your expedition, as opposed to Heracles, who's all alone, Perseus, who's all alone, and Theseus is all alone. Now you have this new idea of kind of joining with other heroes on expedition. So guess what that's the archetype for? Think of superheroes.
The Avengers.
There it is. This is the Avengers archetype, right? So that's where the idea of heroes joining together on an expedition comes from.